In the calm atmosphere of a suburban neighborhood, where the sound of children playing mixed with the hum of lawnmowers and distant traffic, one couple seemed to represent everything stable and admirable. The husband was known for his dedication to his work as a contractor, a man who had built homes for others and earned a reputation for reliability. His wife, a beloved teacher, carried herself with warmth and sincerity. She had patience for even the most difficult children, and parents often praised her for her kindness. Together they looked like the picture of happiness, a couple that others admired from afar and envied in silence. What no one knew was that beneath the surface, their marriage was shifting, silently and invisibly, like a fault line waiting to crack open. The changes began slowly. The husband started working later hours, telling his wife that deadlines were piling up and clients needed extra attention. At first, she accepted it without suspicion. He had always been a hard worker, and his long hours seemed natural. But the late-night calls, the sudden trips, and the growing distance between them soon became a regular pattern. The wife noticed his distracted behavior, the way he avoided eye contact during simple conversations, and how often he retreated into silence. She told herself it was just stress, a phase that would pass with time, never allowing herself to imagine that something much darker was developing in secret. Unbeknownst to her, her husband had found someone else. It was not a fling or a moment of weakness, but an affair that had grown roots in secrecy. The woman he was seeing outside of marriage was different from his wife, bold, demanding, and unafraid to push him toward choices he would never have considered alone. Their meetings were hidden behind excuses and carefully planned lies, each encounter pulling him further away from his home and his vows. While the wife folded laundry, prepared lessons, and believed in the life they had built together, her husband was building something entirely different with another woman, a secret life that thrived in the shadows. The mistress did not want to remain in the background forever. At first, stolen hours were enough. But as the affair grew, so did her dissatisfaction with being hidden. She wanted more than fleeting affection and whispered promises. She wanted permanence, a life free of competition, and she began to make it clear that she would not settle for less. The husband found himself torn between two worlds, the respectability of his marriage and the dangerous excitement of his affair. What made the situation worse was his inability to choose. He wanted to keep both, to maintain the image of a stable family man while also indulging in the passion of his secret relationship. As he juggled the two lives, cracks spread through his perfect facade. Neighbors noticed his absence more often, though they assumed it was work-related. Friends saw his wife alone at events, quietly explaining that her husband was busy, and they nodded with sympathy without questioning further. To the outside world, everything still looked intact, but the foundation was eroding beneath them. The wife felt it too, though she struggled to put it into words. Sometimes she caught the faint scent of perfume on his clothes, a brand she did not own. Other times, she noticed how he avoided her touch, quick to shift away or offer excuses about exhaustion. A knot of unease grew in her chest, but her trust in him was strong, built over years of believing in his loyalty. She chose not to confront him directly, convincing herself that love could survive even the silences that had begun to dominate their nights. Meanwhile, the mistress's influence deepened. She was not content with patience or secrecy. Every time he hesitated, she reminded him of what they could have together if only the wife were no longer in the way. These reminders planted dangerous ideas in his mind, thoughts he had never allowed himself before. What if his marriage ended, not through divorce, but in a way that erased all obstacles? He dismissed the thought at first, shaken by its weight, but the seed had been planted, and once planted, such thoughts rarely disappear. To the wife, life continued as usual. She went to work, prepared lessons for her students, and greeted neighbors with her gentle smile. Nothing in her behavior suggested she suspected betrayal or danger, yet in the silence of her home, her husband was already drifting farther away, pulled into a world of lies, secrecy, and growing obsession. While she planned for another school year and thought about small dreams of family vacations or future milestones, her husband's dreams were turning darker, shaped by the whispers of someone who wanted everything she had. The quiet streets of the neighborhood held no clue of the storm brewing within one household. For those who passed by, it was just another house with a trimmed lawn, a car in the driveway, and curtains drawn at night. But behind those walls, choices were being made that would lead to betrayal, heartbreak, and eventually a crime that no one in that peaceful town could ever have predicted. The life that seemed so stable from the outside was already unraveling, thread by thread, until the moment when it would all fall apart in the most shocking way. The affair grew stronger with each passing month, and what had started as an escape soon became a dangerous dependency. The husband, once proud of his reputation and family life, found himself tangled in a web of lies too complex to manage. Every late night demanded a new excuse. Every secret meeting required another story. At first, he managed to keep up appearances, carefully balancing both sides of his life. But as his mistress's demands increased, his ability to maintain control began to falter. She had grown tired of waiting in the shadows, tired of being second to the wife who seemed so secure in her role. In her eyes, she had already invested too much time and emotion to be dismissed as temporary. She started to pressure him more directly, asking when he would finally make a decision, when he would choose her completely. Her tone shifted from hopeful to insistent, leaving him feeling cornered. He knew that a divorce would cost him dearly, financially, socially and professionally. The thought of admitting to the affair terrified him. Yet the idea of losing the mistress who now held such a grip on his emotions felt unbearable. In their conversations, ideas began to surface that neither had ever spoken aloud before. At first, they were hints, sharp remarks laced with frustration. What if she was gone? What if the wife was no longer standing in the way of their future? The husband would nervously dismiss these suggestions, but the seed was planted, and soon the thought became harder to ignore. With each passing day, the mistress fed the idea more boldly, framing it not as cruelty, but as a necessary sacrifice for love. She painted vivid pictures of the life they could have, free from secrecy, where they could live openly and without the burden of lies. The husband resisted at first, but temptation slowly took over reason. He imagined a life where he would not have to divide his time or his emotions. He could have passion without guilt, companionship without the weight of a broken marriage. The more he entertained these thoughts, the more possible they seemed. What once felt unthinkable began to feel like a solution. He convinced himself that no one would ever suspect him, that if the plan were executed carefully, it would appear as nothing more than a tragic accident. They began to discuss the details in hushed tones, treating the unimaginable as though it were a problem to be solved. Timing was crucial, they decided, and so was creating a believable cover. The husband knew his wife's routines well: when she left for work, when she returned, the errands she ran, the habits she rarely broke. Every piece of information became part of their blueprint. They considered various methods, always circling back to one goal. Her death needed to look natural, an accident that would leave no trace of their involvement. Arrogance began to cloud their judgment. The mistress, intoxicated by the idea of victory, underestimated how difficult it would be to keep such a plan flawless. The husband, who prided himself on being practical and logical, believed his experience with construction and planning would give him the edge in executing it. Together, they convinced themselves that they were capable of outsmarting everyone: neighbors, family, investigators, even fate itself. What they failed to see was how every criminal plan, no matter how carefully constructed, leaves behind cracks. Their confidence blinded them to the small details that would eventually betray them: a misplaced item, an unaccounted-for message, a timeline that didn't fully align. These were the kinds of mistakes they ignored in their rush to secure their future. Meanwhile, the wife remained unaware of the danger circling around her. She noticed her husband's distance more than ever, but she held on to hope that things would improve. She threw herself into her teaching, finding comfort in the laughter of children and the routine of her classroom. To her friends, she mentioned that her marriage felt strained, but she avoided elaborating. She still believed in her husband, even when his behavior made trust more difficult. She never allowed herself to think that betrayal could run so deep, or that her very life was being quietly threatened by the man she had shared everything with. The stage was set. While she went about her daily routines, her husband and his mistress sharpened their plan in secrecy, waiting for the right moment to strike. To the outside world, the couple was still intact, still respectable, still enviable. But behind closed doors, love had transformed into obsession, and obsession into conspiracy. What began as infidelity had now evolved into something much darker, a plot so dangerous that once set in motion, it would be impossible to turn back. The quiet house on the corner of the street, with its tidy yard and friendly facade, had become the center of a story no one would ever expect. The husband and mistress believed their plan was airtight, certain that no one would see through their performance. They convinced themselves that they had everything under control. What they didn't realize was that their perfect plan was already unraveling in ways they could not yet see, setting the stage for the shocking downfall that would follow. The night chosen for the plan arrived with an eerie stillness, the kind of quiet that makes every sound sharper, every shadow darker. The husband had spent days preparing himself, rehearsing his actions in his mind, convincing himself that once it was over, life would finally make sense again. He had told himself the lie so many times that he almost believed it, that he was not committing an act of cruelty, but securing a future that had already been stolen from him by the trap of his marriage. The mistress's voice echoed in his thoughts, feeding his courage and dulling his conscience. She had assured him that it would be quick, efficient and untraceable. All he had to do was follow through. The wife went about her evening unaware that anything unusual was about to happen. She prepared dinner, tidied the kitchen and settled into the familiar comfort of her home. But something weighed on her. For weeks she had noticed the subtle changes. The perfume that was not hers, the missed calls when her husband slipped out of the room, the sudden distance in his eyes. The feeling she could not shake grew heavier that night, a tension that settled in her chest. Though she didn't know the details, instinct told her something was wrong. It was a quiet alarm bell, and she listened to it in her own way by making small changes to her usual routine, shifting her schedule without telling anyone. The husband's plan relied on predictability. He knew her habits, when she would be in one room or another, when she would lock up the house, when she would take her nightly walk to the corner store. Every detail had been mapped out with the precision of a blueprint, but when she broke her pattern, even in the smallest way, it disrupted the fragile design of his plan. Instead of finding her exactly where he expected, he was forced to improvise. And in that moment, the clean lines of his careful preparation blurred into chaos. The struggle that followed was nothing like he imagined. In his mind, he had pictured silence, control, and a swift resolution. In reality, the wife fought back with a strength fueled by betrayal and fear. She may not have known the full truth of his affair, but in those moments she understood enough. The shock of seeing the man she trusted turn into a threat ignited something primal within her. She clawed, resisted, and left behind a scene he could never fully erase. Objects were overturned, marks were left behind, and in his frantic state he failed to notice how much evidence he was scattering around him. When it was over, the husband stood in the silence of a house that no longer felt like home. He had convinced himself that he would feel relief, but instead he felt the weight of something irreversible pressing down on him. His hands shook as he tried to clean the scene, wiping surfaces, moving objects, and destroying what he thought were obvious signs of the struggle. But fear clouded his mind, and he missed the details that would later betray him, the faint smear he overlooked, the displaced item he forgot to replace, the timing that no longer matched his carefully constructed alibi. He left the house believing that he had done enough, that the plan was still intact, that suspicion would never point in his direction. He relied on the image he had built over years, the devoted husband, the hard-working man, the neighbor everyone respected. He thought that mask would shield him from doubt, but masks crack when placed under too much pressure, and his had already begun to slip. Outside, the world moved as if nothing had happened. Streetlights flickered on, cars passed by in the distance, and the neighborhood remained quiet. To anyone looking at the house from the street, it seemed like any other evening. No one would have guessed that inside, betrayal had erupted into violence, leaving behind traces that no amount of cleaning could truly conceal. As the husband drove away, rehearsing his story in his mind, he failed to realize that the storm he thought he had avoided was only just beginning. The wife's sudden change of routine, the evidence scattered in his panic, and the neighbors who had heard unusual sounds would all conspire against him. The perfect crime he and his mistress had so arrogantly imagined was already fractured. He believed he had succeeded, but in truth he had only set into motion the unraveling of everything he thought he had secured. The night ended in silence, but it was not the silence of victory. It was the silence before discovery, the quiet pause before the weight of truth comes crashing down. The husband returned to his mistress with false assurances, claiming that the plan had worked, that they were now free. She clung to his words, desperate to believe. Neither of them knew that the cracks in their plan had already spread too wide, and it was only a matter of time before the entire conspiracy collapsed around them. The following morning began with unease. The wife's absence did not go unnoticed for long. At the school where she taught, her colleagues grew concerned when she failed to appear for her classes. She was known for her punctuality, the kind of teacher who arrived early to prepare her lessons and stayed late to help students who needed extra attention. Missing a day without warning was completely out of character. Calls to her phone went unanswered, messages were left with no response, and by midday her friends and co-workers began to worry. At home, the husband played his role with careful precision. He pretended to be surprised when others reached out, maintaining a mask of concern that he had practiced in his mind. He called her phone as well, leaving voicemails that sounded tender, though his words were empty of true emotion. He believed his performance would be enough to shield him, just as it had in the past. Yet the police were notified quickly, and when they arrived at the house, small inconsistencies began to reveal themselves almost immediately. Officers noticed details that an ordinary person might overlook. The house appeared too clean in some areas, as though surfaces had been wiped in a hurry. A rug was slightly out of place. A chair had marks that suggested it had been knocked over and then hastily set upright. Neighbors reported hearing unusual noises the night before, muffled sounds of struggle that they had dismissed in the moment. One even mentioned seeing a car parked briefly outside that did not belong to anyone in the neighborhood. Each small observation added weight to the growing suspicion. The husband attempted to present his alibi with confidence. He explained that he had been elsewhere, busy with work, supported by receipts and carefully crafted timelines. At first glance, it seemed convincing, but investigators were thorough. They cross-checked his story with phone records and security footage from nearby locations. Soon gaps appeared. His phone had pinged in places he had not mentioned. Cameras captured his vehicle at times that contradicted his version of events. What he thought was airtight began to unravel quickly. The mistress, watching events unfold from a distance, grew increasingly anxious. She had imagined that once the wife was gone, life would become simpler, more secure. Instead, the pressure only increased. Whispers spread in the community. People speculated, and her connection to the husband became harder to hide. Each time they spoke, her voice betrayed her fear. She worried about investigators discovering their relationship, about being linked to the plan she had so eagerly encouraged. Panic began to eat away at the boldness she once carried. Forensic teams worked meticulously inside the house. Despite the husband's frantic attempts to erase evidence, traces remained. There were faint smears that revealed the presence of blood, fibers caught in places he had overlooked, and signs of a violent confrontation that could not be explained away by ordinary life. Investigators pieced these together patiently, building a picture that contradicted his narrative. The wife had not simply vanished. Something deliberate had happened, and the trail pointed directly back to him. As news spread through the community, shock and disbelief filled the air. Neighbors who had once admired the couple struggled to reconcile their memories with the growing revelations. The husband had been the image of stability. Always polite, always hard-working. The wife had been gentle and kind, the sort of woman who lit up every room she entered. The possibility that such darkness had been hiding behind their walls unsettled everyone. Conversations hushed when his name was mentioned. People who once greeted him warmly now spoke with suspicion, remembering small details they had ignored before: his sudden mood swings, his absences, his distracted behavior. The husband continued to act as though he were innocent, but the cracks in his story widened with each day. Detectives pressed him with questions, testing his answers against evidence they had already gathered. His confidence faltered. The more he tried to maintain the performance, the more his lies tangled together. He underestimated how relentless an investigation could be, how every overlooked moment could return to haunt him. Meanwhile, the mistress became a liability. Her panic grew harder to control, and the investigator's quiet persistence pushed her closer to the edge. She had believed in their invincibility, but the reality of police scrutiny and the weight of guilt were things she had never prepared for. Fear consumed her, and her once unwavering loyalty began to shift toward self-preservation. The perfect crime that had been designed in whispers and secrecy was unraveling before their eyes. The plan that promised freedom now threatened to expose everything they had tried to hide. The husband clung to the illusion that he could still escape, but each piece of evidence added another layer to the case against him. The house that once seemed like a sanctuary had transformed into a crime scene, and the respect he had enjoyed in his community dissolved into suspicion and quiet condemnation. What he thought was under control was slipping away, and with each passing day, the truth drew closer. The betrayal, the lies, the obsession, all of it was beginning to surface, and there was no way to stop the tide once it had turned. The unraveling came faster than either the husband or the mistress expected. Once investigators confirmed the inconsistencies in his alibi, their attention shifted toward uncovering the hidden layers of his life. Phone records told a story he had tried desperately to bury. Dozens of late-night calls to the same number, text messages laced with urgency, and location data that placed him near the mistress's apartment far too often to be coincidental. The carefully built image of a loyal husband collapsed with every discovery, and soon the affair was no longer a secret but a glaring truth in the eyes of the law. Detectives knew that people rarely commit crimes in isolation, and once the mistress's name surfaced, the case began to sharpen into focus. She was questioned discreetly at first, but even in those early conversations, her unease was obvious. Her voice trembled, her story shifted under pressure, and she struggled to maintain consistency. She insisted she had no knowledge of the wife's disappearance, but her nervous behavior betrayed her words. Investigators had seen it before, the cracking facade of someone hiding more than they could bear. The weight of the situation became too much for her. The mistress, who had once urged the husband toward bold and dangerous choices, could no longer carry the burden of silence. In a desperate attempt to save herself, she broke. Her confession was not calm or calculated but rushed, spilling out in fragments, as though releasing the truth was the only way to breathe again. She admitted to the affair, to the conversations about wanting the wife gone, and finally, to the planning that had escalated into action. She painted herself as less involved than she truly was, emphasizing the husband's role, but even her attempt to deflect responsibility gave investigators exactly what they needed. The husband's defense collapsed instantly under her testimony. Every denial he had rehearsed, every excuse he had crafted, became useless. He had believed that loyalty would bind her to him, that their shared secret would ensure her silence. He never considered how fear could rewrite loyalty into betrayal. The mistress, once his ally, had become the very person who destroyed the walls he thought would protect him. The community reacted with horror as the story reached the public. Neighbors who had once waved at the couple from across the street now avoided the husband's house entirely, whispering about how none of them had seen the signs. Parents at the school mourned the loss of a teacher who had touched their children's lives, placing flowers at the gates in her memory. What had seemed like a perfect family had turned into a chilling story of betrayal, obsession, and violence. The contrast between the life they projected and the reality that had unfolded behind closed doors left everyone shaken. For investigators, the case became a clear example of arrogance leading to downfall. The husband and mistress had believed they could construct a flawless plan, one that would erase suspicion and leave them free to build a new life together. But every detail they overlooked, every slip in their stories, and every careless trace left behind, became a thread for detectives to pull. Piece by piece, the illusion unraveled until the truth stood exposed for all to see. When the trial began, the courtroom filled with a mixture of grief, curiosity, and anger. The prosecution laid out the evidence with precision, from the phone records to the forensic findings inside the home. They highlighted the inconsistencies in the husband's statements and the damning confession of the mistress. The defense tried to cast doubt, portraying the mistress as unreliable and unstable, but the weight of physical evidence was too great. The jury listened, watched, and ultimately saw through the fragile attempts to obscure reality. The verdict was inevitable. Both the husband and the mistress were found guilty, their dreams of freedom replaced with sentences that would confine them for decades. The husband sat expressionless as the decision was read, the mask he had worn for so long finally shattered beyond repair. The mistress wept, her earlier bravado gone, replaced by the crushing realization that her obsession had destroyed not only the woman she envied, but also the future she craved. The story closed with a haunting sense of loss. A woman who had devoted her life to kindness and teaching was gone, taken not by accident or fate, but by the selfishness of those she trusted most. A community that once celebrated the couple as a symbol of stability now remembered them only as a warning. The betrayal, the lies, and the murder plot served as a grim reminder that evil does not always come from strangers in the dark. Sometimes, it grows quietly inside the very home meant to be a place of love and safety. In the end, the husband and mistress gained nothing from their crime. Instead of the life they imagined, they were left with ruined reputations, shattered illusions, and years behind bars. Their story, once hidden in secrecy, became a cautionary tale told in whispers long after the courtroom closed. It was proof that no matter how carefully a lie is built, the truth always finds a way to break through, and when it does, it destroys everything in its path.